Welcome to the Inclusion Solution Live. My name is Gabby Gonzalez, Marketing and PR Strategist here at the Winters Group. And today we're wrapping up our Justice for All season of the podcast, where our team has had the pleasure of welcoming some of the speakers from our recent Justice for All Summit. We're actually already planning for next year's summit, which will be held April 22nd through 24th, 2025. So mark your calendars and be sure to check wintersgroup.com for updates. So today we're joined by Dr. Durryle Brooks, who presented an inspiring session on operationalizing love at the 2024 Justice for All Summit. Thank you for coming by today, Dr. Brooks.
Thank you so much, Gabby, for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Oh, wonderful. And just to give a little introduction here, Dr. Brooks is an interdisciplinary research scholar practitioner and a social justice educator from Baltimore, Maryland. He is the founder and CEO of Love and Justice Consulting, LLC, an organizational and leadership development firm that provides leaders with diversity and social justice learning opportunities to increase their capacity to effectively and authentically engage difference. Dr. Brooks is the author of Reconceptualizing Love, Moving Towards a Critical Theory of Love in Education for Social Justice in the Journal of Critical Thought and Praxis, which articulates a vision and framework for reconceptualizing love in ways that produces intersectional justice and healing for people of color, communities, and our society as a whole. Wow. So thanks again for joining us. And tell us a little bit more about you and your background. How did you come to this work and what inspired you, Dr. Brooks?
Thank you. One of the things that it's when I'm asked the question about who I am and sort of where did I come from, what inspires me, I actually had to take it back to my place of birth. And you mentioned it, Baltimore. And I'd like to contextualize that. Like, I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, and I came of age during the time of both the war on drugs, at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and where the level of overt systemic inequality and the redlining was the foundation. So I grew up in a little small neighborhood called Cherry Hill in Baltimore, Maryland, which was a redline neighborhood. We were positioned next to an incinerator where the smoke continued, the ash, the toxins continued to sort of blow in our neighborhood, increasing sort of asthma rates in our neighborhood. I came of age during a time where transportation wouldn't even come to my neighborhood. So I kind of grew up on like this, it felt like an island. There were more liquor stores on our corners, and then sort of anything, we could hardly sustain a actual grocery store. And so I name all of that because all of those things were sort of the macro contexts that were actually traumatizing me and creating sort of, I think, the foundation for me to be able to feel unwanted, and felt like I didn't matter, let alone my community did not matter, because of the ways in which policy decisions had been made for 100 plus years in the city. And I then found myself in a space of also trying to navigate my emergent sexual identity as a gay, queer young person. And I think this whole idea of love emerged from that. What I got clear about was that, and I don't talk about it often, is that something happens to those of us who are come from parents who are addicted to drugs. And as someone who had both biological parents as substance users, the level of abandonment that I felt and neglect was significant and severe. And so for me, the question of love has always been sort of a preoccupation for me, because I was curious, and particularly I know differently now, but back at that time, I was always asking, well, Mom, if you love me enough, why wouldn't you sort of get clean? Or Dad, if you so it's just all of this stuff that had me to know that the idea of love and the practice of it was important and necessary for our transformation and development and our healing ultimately. So I think what inspired me to do this work was feeling that profound neglect, and deciding to begin to interrogate it in a much more systemic way than just the sort of interpersonal familial dynamics. To ask structural questions about love in order for me to begin to sort of make sense of the lack of deprivation of love, the lack of a discourse of a robust love in the society, that it goes beyond just purely romance, but to think about what does it mean for us to be well as a community, to love each other as a community or communities that have been historically marginalized. And so that's kind of like a part of my origin in this work.
Oh yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And you mentioned, kind of stepping back and looking at everything systemically. Did that change the way that you were, or did it make it easier for you to work through that because you were looking at it in that way?
I think sort of the truth, and I realized this when I was doing my research, my dissertation research on love, is that I actually went to the systemic as a strategy to not deal with the interpersonal
Mm.
feelings of hurt, pain, and isolation that
Mhm.
I felt. And so it actually was an escape, because if I dealt with the structural pieces, it meant that I didn't have to talk about personal accountability, mutuality, and connection, mutual connection.
Mhm.
And that was a learning that I had, because I thought when I started my work, oh, I only want structural change. Oh, give me policy change, give me all of these things. But what I realized in that moment is that, yes, we need structural and policy change, but if we don't tend to the sort of tender into the more intimate, interpersonal dimensions of our lives, we cannot do the work, I think, of liberation and transformation. And so
Mhm.
I try to take a multi-level approach is to doing justice-centered work.
I'm curious as to, so then was that something that was almost like a ramp, like it helped you get to that point where you could do the interpersonal?
It did. It did. And so, for example, when I was doing my research on love, which, first of all, most folks don't do, like it's not a lot of folks out here doing research on love, and particularly trying to explore what does love mean to the oppressed and the
Mm.
historically marginalized and the maligned. And it was in that work where I was asking in my, I was doing like pre-studies, like mini studies to try to understand like where to even go. Like I didn't know what to do. I was just trying to figure this stuff out. And I was only asking about love at the structural level. And I was talking to some Black gay folks. We were just having a conversation. And they had said something to me like, well, if you just keep talking about these structural things, you're actually erasing my
Mm.
everyday lived experience. And that hit me like a watershed.
Wow.
And it then sort of put the perspective onto me as to sort of why would I only be seeking a structural solution? And in that pursuit, at what cost to the people, and what do I value about them? And what I don't value about them. And what I was learning was I wasn't valuing their lived experience. So sure, I could talk about the
Mm.
structural dimensions of this, but it would be another act of violence and erasure to not tend to their heart, their love, their connections to their communities and their families. And for me, that was a transformative moment and doing that research.
Yes, actually, if we could back up just a moment and explain a little bit more about operationalizing love and your framework, and sort of like explain how that connects to social transformation.
Yeah. So in my dissertation work, I pursued the question of sort of what is the role of love in social transformation. And I had started out studying love in undergraduate, and I'm a religious studies major at a small liberal arts college in Maryland called St. Mary's College, Maryland. And it was in that space that I started to look at Dr. King's philosophy on love and how he was using that to sort of mobilize folks during the civil rights movement. So that led me to sort of ideas of personalism, which is a belief that the divine lives inside of us
Mhm.
and that we're all sacred. And it also led to my understanding of love, not just in the purely romantic sense, but also in the sense of political will and our insistence on it as a necessary function of justice. And so what ended up happening is because I started that work in undergraduate, I went to do some additional work, grad school, and I didn't intend to do more work on love in my PhD program. But what happened in that space was that I went to a place and I was with social justice practitioners who are profound and prolific writers.
Mm.
And in the classroom, they told us that their role there was to actually colonize us. And
Mm.
I remember in that moment losing my breath and looking around the room to other Black and Brown students who were in the space, shocked. And I literally felt my body floating, and I could see myself looking down at me. And because I had been traumatized in the past before, and that was the second time it happened, I knew
Mm.
that there was a relationship between what I was experiencing in that classroom and education and trauma. And so that reshifted my work to be thinking about, if the people who have been tasked to lead justice work still engage in practices that reproduce oppression and use the same tools to then try to get us to be prepared, because that was the logic. It was like, well, we're just trying to get you prepared for the academy,
Mm.
as a justification and a rationale, then what is actually possible if I'm going to be with people who say one thing and do something else that's harmful and toxic? And I had to make
Mhm.
sense of that. And so my framework was born out of that tension. When one say, "Oh, I want justice," but then I do harm, I say, I don't think that's what love is.
Mm.
And so the question that you asked me around specifically how this begins to relate to justice, that it all is about justice work. It is about sort of the ways in which justice begins to live in our day-to-day actions, not just abstract constructs or concepts that we might learn or pick up and read. We live in a time now where everybody has access to lots and lots of social justice, JEDI, DEI material, and they have a language, but they have not done the work of self-awareness to engage sort of how have these systems living in our minds and bodies reproduce the same hurts, harms, and violence
Mm.
as broader things that we say we want to resist. And so my work really is about trying to attend to that question. And so the critical theory of love framework is a multi-step process that I believe helps people, if we invested in it more time, energy, resources, that would hopefully create space for us to grapple with releasing old ways, old scripts, old ways of knowing and doing that
Mhm.
we may not have it in the front of our consciousness. It might be operating in the back, but it's hard to see if we don't have that critical self-reflection, the
Mhm.
core part of our justice work.
Absolutely. No, that unlearning is so important, and it's you can't really get there without the self-awareness piece.
Mhm.
That's so that you really need. Um, so curious, you were talking about all the different levels of love and different angles of looking at it. What role does self-love play in this, or how is that addressed in this framework?
Yeah. So one of the things that I found is that so the presentation that I gave, it was a short, like 1 hour. Usually the session runs from 4 to 6 hours, 2 days. So it was a
Mm.
condensed version. And so I talk about sort of some pillars of love that I um, sort of gleaned from the lived experiences of Black queer cultural workers, so educators, organizers, activists. And so self-love was a core and essential part of that. Because what I discovered in that work, self-love, they talked about it as in service of self-discovery and self-affirmation. And that we had to learn and relearn how to take up space, and then develop the skills of self-compassion in order for us to actually do the work of transformation. It's hard to transform if you can't make a mistake. If you're
Mhm.
unwilling to learn from those mistakes, it doesn't justify us. We don't just say, like, just go make a, but if I'm so focused on being perfect and not making a mistake,
Mhm.
when I do, without the skill of self-compassion, I will spiral and get stuck in guilt and shame and blame. And for me, I don't believe that that is the way in which I would have people to feel in this world, right? We feel it in
Mhm.
any way, bigger macro systems, like that we don't have to do that shame and guilt and blaming that we sometimes carry out on ourselves because of the ways in which systems have been embedded inside
Yeah.
of for many, many years. A critical theory of love, as I talk about in my framework, is that there is a discourse of love. Usually, you see it in the media, you see it in movies. Those are our fairy tale fantasies. Those are my Bonnie and Clyde type esque situations. Those are my torrid love affairs between Bella and Jacob, and
Mm.
like Bridgerton. I'm obsessed with. Like they are communicating a particular kind and type of love that if we don't check it, like I indulge because I love it, but if I didn't have a frame to sort of analyze it, what I choose to, I would come to believe, because we've been socialized, it's a socialization process, that
Mhm.
those are the ways in which I should be aspiring for love. But then when you also look at that, a part of my work, the critique that I lodge against the normative or everyday construction of love, like those narratives that we find in the media, um, is that most of them are not designed for me. They're not designed for folks who look like us. They're not designed. They love is then bound to straight, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied. Like
Mhm.
that's who gets to access it. That's who
Mhm.
it's for. But then what about me who never saw myself for many years? It's only in the last, 10, 15 years that
Yeah.
LGBT folks and representations of love even made it to the mainstream media. But I had 25 years of socialization to say that actually love wasn't for you. It was only for them. That really spurred me to kind of see why this work was so important for Black and Brown communities, because we weren't shown as deserving of it and then treated as such.
Yeah, and even now, like, this work is so needed because now there's even a backlash against, or there has been for a while, against DEI work. So,
Mhm.
how does your framework help with addressing that and addressing the healing?
Yeah, so one of the things that I sort of try to talk about in my work is that the definitions that I feel like most folks talk about or operate from around social justice, DEI. Like I just turned 40 a few weeks ago, and I have been right, like, like I've been around long enough to sort of watch the transition of language. I was here with multicultural education, critical multicultural education. It went to then DEI, actually it was inclusion, DEI, Jedi, like juice. I mean, so they were just, the language has been shifting and changing over my own lifetime.
Hmm.
And so what I've learned is that while the language is shifting and changing, the core practices of those frameworks, the thing that they ask us and invite us to do pretty much stays similar and intact.
Yes.
And at the same time, I believe that our moment is calling for something else. We have greater understanding of trauma, the way that it lives in our bodies and our minds, that it can be transferred from generation to generation, intergenerational transmission, stuff that I did not know about trauma 15, 20 years ago. So I believe right now our work on a social justice or diversity, equity, and inclusion lens and belonging is and first has to be centered in that new truth, which is it has to be trauma centered and healing focused. And so when I think about justice work, how does it move people to greater and greater degrees of self-exploration, self-affirmation,
Mm.
self-exploration, and then allow to then create space for deeper connections across different communities? And so the way that in which I sort of address this work and enter this work is that we are better together. And but being better together means that we actually have to be able to hold that my truth, my reality might be different than yours, and that we can have multiple truths, and
Mhm.
yours isn't better than mine, it's just different. And so, how do we then create the tools and practices and processes to help bring people together who have different worldviews and different lived experiences? And none of them are quote unquote necessarily wrong, they're just different. And so I believe in this moment, this work is requiring a different kind of quote unquote DEI leader.
Mhm.
Those leaders are able to be able to hold multiple truths, multiple realities, and then have practices and tools to actually begin to stitch and weave, create openings. And I'm a dialogue practitioner, so dialogic openings where people can encounter themselves and the other in profound ways that actually lead to transformation. And that is a different skill set than sort of what I know about sort of folks who are sometimes are just going to get credentials or certifications. And in those spaces, sometimes don't attend to the self-awareness work that needs to go into it. If they talk about it, it takes time to actually develop it, right? And
Oh,
so, so you do that. And in some ways, a lot of the younger folks who are sort of coming up in this space, we have been, I believe, socialized to believe that information exchange is the point of DEI or Jedi work. It is a part of it, but that's just the beginning. That's the foundation.
mhm.
And so, what comes after um, the history and the context and how we begin to grapple with that? And my work is like, okay, so how do you then sort of create space for people to grapple? How do you create a safe and affirming space where people can actually do the work of unlearning, which you talked about a little bit earlier ago.
Mhm.
And to do that in a way that allows them to see the ways in which systems are still influencing their day-to-day behaviors. And so my work is a self-to-systems approach. Some people just do a systems level analysis. I'm saying it's a self-to-system because those systems, those beliefs, those structures literally get codified in our bodies, um, into our brains and our minds, and then we police ourselves. The system doesn't have to necessarily do that anymore because we're already doing the work because we've been socialized um, to believe certain things about other people or ourselves, for example.
Absolutely. Now I'm wondering if we could drill down a little bit more and maybe start naming some specifics.
Mm.
For example, so as far as like, the injustices that continue to persist in the workplace, for example.
Yeah, as a practitioner, I support a lot of different organizations. And so I see a lot of stuff. I still see, um, from my perspective, some of the old players. So, like, domination and control, the micromanagement that's really tied into not only personality, but relies on sort of racialized or gender stereotypes or ableist stereotypes to sort of suggest that, oh, I have to look more closely at them because they don't have, or they might be a DEI, quote unquote, higher, all of that coded language, dog whistle language there. And so we see a lot of that. Also still see a lot of literally just not valuing people,
Mm,
that people value products and outcomes and very little about the process. And I do believe we need to be worried about products and outcomes, but not at the expense of the dignity of the people who are
mm,
actually producing them. And I think those are usually the places where folks tend to struggle, or at least that I've seen, because it's like, oh, we got to do this. We got to do this in service of this community. We got to achieve this deliverable, not realizing that we're actually running down the people who sometimes make up those very communities that we're supporting,
mm,
or the things that we're
mhm,
trying to accomplish. And so, from that perspective, um, like I feel like those are just kind of like standard, everyday, like
mhm.
old guard, if you will.
Yes.
I think some of the new dynamics that I'm sort of seeing at heightened levels is the the use of language, social justice language and lingo at a different level and a scale that I have not seen before to actually stop conversation going. Yeah, so that might look like a white person saying, "Oh, this is my white fragility showing up here," as to sort of preemptively sort of signal, say, hey, look, I have enough information, I've read enough books, I can do that. But what they're doing is actually shutting down the space for the
Mm,
interrogation of what that meant for the persons who might have been on the receiving end of a macroaggression, or some type of harm. So I've been seeing a lot more of people being able to use the language without necessarily an analysis of the impact of the behavior. So they'll shorthand it. They'll preemptive, like, yeah, that's my white supremacy, or that's my ableism showing up, or and what are you going to do
mm,
about it? Are you willing to change? Are you willing to be in conversation about the impact that that's had on other people? Can you receive feedback about that and not get
mhm,
defensive? Um, and so once something is flagged and lifted, my belief is that we should engage it,
mhm.
even if that engagement is like, I don't know what this really meant, but I know something happened here.
Right.
And let's spend some time figuring out what that is and how it's shaping our realities and our relationships and our capacity to be together in this moment, but moving forward as well.
Yeah, that really speaks to, when you mentioned just trying to treat the people who are working on the process with dignity. That certainly is a way. Are there other examples of, how that might look different?
Yeah, and I think so. The other piece of this work that I've found is that begin it's hard for me to do my work without understanding a deeper understanding of trauma, particularly racialized trauma,
Mm,
in this space. And so what I've seen happen is that collectively we've experienced so much trauma, both from the pandemic and then on top of our own interpersonal, like community level trauma, that we might be experienced just as we navigate life, that we're actually not positioned to receive feedback. We're not really ready or able because we actually don't have capacity anymore. One of
mm,
the things that people talk a lot of, I don't feel people talk about it, that when we're traumatized and it goes untreated and unhealed, it is like a valve seeping out energy and you're trying to sort of clog it, but you're not really figuring out the best way to treat it. And
Mm.
so, what I find is that when folks are trying to engage in meaningful conversations, it's hard because they're short, they're tired, they got lives, full lives, and they got layers and layers of work on top of it. And so they actually, not because they're necessarily bad people, it's just that they don't have anything else to give. And you're trying to come in here and say, we about to change a process. I'm barely surviving on the process that we have right now. And now you want to add, and say, I need to do something different. And then that level of resistance gets coded as bad versus
Mm-hmm.
that resistance telling us something about what we might need to explore in our environment to ensure that we can move people through a process to get them there. And so what I've seen is that people see resistance as bad
Mm-hmm.
and negative, and instead of asking questions about what the resistance is telling us about what might need to be, what's going on at the individual level, what people are in terms of their capacity currently, what the shift and change will require, and more importantly, what will the organization have to invest in order
Mm.
for them to actually be able to acquiesce to that change with some relative degree of okayness with that. Like you have to be like relatively okay. You can't be perfectly okay all the time, but I'm
Right.
okay enough to like move this forward.
I love that. What I'm hearing is, responding with curiosity, also not rushing to judgment, right, of these folks.
Absolutely. I think and so one of the things that I joke a lot that like I try not to do much when I'm hangry, and so I have to ask myself if I'm going to go into a meeting or be in an environment, how are you resourcing yourself?
Mm.
I'm like, okay, so did I eat breakfast or lunch, whatever that time frame is? Did I have my snacks? Did I go for a walk? Right. So part of me is like trying to figure out like how to take care of myself.
Mhm.
And so I sort of created what I talk about as a healing map for me, which sort of outlines the various different strategies I use to take care of myself, um, and the commitment and the time that I'm committing every week or every month or every quarter. Um, because what I realize is that when I am not resourced, when I'm not taking the time to be in my therapy sessions, when I'm not taking the time to do in my spiritual practice, when I'm not taking the time to be with my family and friends, when I'm not taking the time to just walk and be with my own self,
Mhm.
it is, uh, I am more likely to act out in ways that I am no longer in agreement or in alignment with. I am no longer willing to sort of, I no longer have space for curiosity. Judgment slips in quickly. I get more short and critical of myself and other people or processes.
Mm.
And so if I'm not doing that, then I find that it is harder for me to be my best self. And the best version of myself, the best healed version of myself, um, in context that will continually be sapping me. So if I'm not putting in and willing to make decisions about spaces in which I'm going to go to or not, so boundaries become very, very important in this space, um, then I lose an opportunity to really show up my best. And I also increase the likelihood of me showing up at my worst.
That so resonates.
Mhm.
And, just again underscores the importance of self-love in this and taking care of yourself. Yes. And so with all that self-care, does that help you, you know, when you're in situations where you kind of have to meet people where they are, as far as this work?
Absolutely. I think so. I do a lot of conflict resolution and mediation work. And so I'm always in the mix of people's pain points, tensions, conflicts, and they
Mm.
take a lot. They take a lot to navigate. And so one of the things that I've learned in my work is that conflict is normal and natural
Mhm.
in our work. It is what becomes toxic or challenging is how we treat each other when we don't get our way in the space. And
Mm.
so when I'm doing my resourcing, partly I'm trying to fill up from listening and sort of helping other people navigate the conflicts that are to some degree always about race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, even though that they might not be the sort of the top priority, but they're still in the mix.
Mhm.
And then they sort of come and represent themselves. And I'm like, oh, okay, so we're tugging on some of these identities that are important to us. And so I resource so that I can then actually be mindful and listen to just receive what someone else is saying because I need to be able to hear pathways or possibilities, which they
Mm,
might not be able to hear because they're deep in their and entrenched in their challenge or dysfunction of a team, organization, or culture. Let alone if they have stuff going on in their personal life.
yeah.
But like, so
It's a
so
lot to take on, and then you have to solve the problem too. So yeah.
yeah, and so I work a lot with caregivers and folks who sort of believe in this very profound sense of giving care. So a lot of educators, social workers, a lot of people who believe that um, people should be cared for really well. And I have learned that in that work that drew them, the thing that drew them to that work is the same thing that also exhausts them.
Mm,
And because the script is that you keep giving and giving and giving and taking care of people because that's what you wanted. That's what you didn't receive in your childhood or at some point in your
mm,
life. So you're going to show up and go extra because they need X, Y, and Z. And reality, what happens is that they burn out. They begin to sort of deplete themselves and
yeah.
they put all their energy on other people and not on themselves. And so oftentimes what I'm having to do in my work is to remind people is that you have to take care of yourself with the same intentionality, depth, the same level of passion and commitment as you do for other people you're serving, because you matter. And to begin to have them to ask questions of themselves about why do they think, I talk about it as the caregiver script. Why do you think that script, where did it come from? Where did you learn that I need to take care and fix everything and always be giving and giving and giving come
Mm,
from? And how has it served you in that space? And is it still working today? Um, so that folks can begin to do the critical work of self-awareness, as we've talked about before, but to then interrupt it to know that they are not just operating out of routine and habit, but they're doing it with intention. But then the second piece is that to figure out ways in which bigger systems like capitalism, like
mhm.
it's like production at all costs. So I'm going to give care, give care, give care, have you working endlessly. That's just capitalism. Like, so slow down. Do you feel like when you take a break, you actually feel rested, or do you feel the urge to get up and begin to do more work? So, like, how do you
Mm,
begin to learn to sit in and sort of be deeply held and not feel like you have to run to do something all the time or to give it to somebody else? Care, concern. So, because of that, I've learned again, this is all love work. It is that folks have to begin to learn and love themselves to the same degree in which they've been taught and socialized to love other people. And so a critical theory of love for me, is an invitation for us to begin to interrogate all of that, as well as some other dynamics that sort of are part of the framework. Yeah.
oh my goodness, this is all resonating. Love all of these lessons, and I wish we had more time.
Mhm.
Um, if people wanted to learn more about your framework, where can they go?
Absolutely. So folks can check out my website, www.loveandjusticeconsulting.com. You can also search my name because it's a very unique spelling to my first name. And if you put that into the search bar, you will only find me because my mom got creative. So you can do that, and then that'll pull up the articles, keynotes, addresses that I've given on my work, and so forth. Also, I invite people to follow me on LinkedIn at Dr. Durryle Brooks, and on my social media, Love and Justice Consulting.
Really appreciate you, and people can always come back and re-listen because there were so many gems this first time around. I need to listen again. Uh, well, is there anything else you'd like to share today, or anything else you'd like to leave listeners with?
Yeah, I thank you for that invitation, and I think sort of um, I'll end with this idea, which is because a part of my work has been fielding criticism and critique from others who says love it doesn't matter or it's not as important, it doesn't achieve justice. And I just want to invite people to think about the idea that settler colonialism interrupted everything. It destroyed families and communities. It erased cultures. It touched every aspect of our lives. Why do why would it wreak havoc on everything, but somehow leave a construction of love untouched? And so for me, when I begin to sort of question that, it begins that the version that we have, the everyday one, actually must serve a function. And I believe that function is to perpetuate systemic inequalities like racism, sexism, and homophobia and white supremacy. And so if that's true, what does love need to be for us in order for us for it to be transformative in our own lives. And so I
Mm.
invite everybody into that question, and I'm curious about what they discover.
Wow, so powerful. Thank you so much for giving us so much to think about here as we wind down. It was so great to have you, and I hope we can have you back again. Um,
Absolutely.
love it. All right. Well, until next time, listeners, keep working toward justice for all. And thank you again to Dr. Brooks.